Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, legal eagles, learners, and luminaries. Welcome to our session. It's titled Perplexing Puzzle, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment. Today, we are honored to have Professor Ahmet Kuru with us, who is a professor of political science at San Diego State University. His book, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, a global and historical comparison, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, is the co-winner of American Political Science Association's International History and Politics Section Book Award. And the discussant for today's talk would be Professor Dr. Adeel Malik, who's Globe Fellow in Economics of Muslim Societies, and he's an associate professor of economics at Oxford University. Over to you, Professor Kuru.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abbasi, for organizing, and thanks to Dr. Malik for being the discussant. I'm going to present just around 10 minutes the main arguments of the book with some PowerPoint slides. The questions start with today. That's why the book has the subtitle, A Global and Historical Comparison. When we put the Muslim world into the global context, in terms of democratization and development, a problem becomes very visible. Muslim world, by which I mean 49 Muslim majority countries, has a very low level of democratization. According to Freedom House recent data, only 14% of these countries are electoral democracies, whereas 60% of the world, all countries in the world, are electoral democracies. In terms of socioeconomic criteria, GNI per capita, literacy rate, schooling life expectancy, again, we see a big gap between not only the Muslim world and Western world, but also the Muslim world and world averages. And my book so far has received around 70 reviews, academic journals and newspapers. One of the criticisms I receive is that Africa and Latin America are also underdeveloped. Why I focus only in the Muslim world. Asian country as well, some critics says. So when you look at the data, you see that in fact, Latin America is doing very well in comparison to Muslim world in terms of democratization. And certain East Asian countries, as we know, economic growth there is very impressive. But there is one more thing that didn't exist in either Latin America or Africa, which is that the Muslim world was leading the world in terms of economic and philosophical development between 8th to 12th centuries. Therefore, this contemporary data combined with the historical fact that 500 years Muslims were teaching Europeans how to make paper, how to produce economic institutions, how to develop philosophical knowledge. Then what happened? What explained, in fact, the gap between early Muslim achievements and recent stagnation? There are two main arguments, one focusing on Islam by Orientalists or right-wing politicians, and the opposite argument blaming Western imperialism. In my book, I take both arguments very seriously, but show their weaknesses. The first one has several weaknesses. One is that Muslims already show the ability of Islam and progress coming together for 500 years or more. And even after the 12th century, Muslims continued to produce very important scholars such as Ibn Khaldun, very cosmopolitan cities like Istanbul, but with certain level of stagnation. And today we see certain variation in Indonesia and Arab countries. They show a variation in terms of development and democracy. The problems of anti-colonial argument also include many points. One is that chronologically, when the widespread Western colonization of the Muslim world started in the 18th and 19th centuries, Muslims already had intellectual and economic stagnation. And despite colonization, East Asian countries achieved economic growth, and certain Latin American countries achieved democratization. Therefore, colonization cannot be the only cause of the problems. There is a more scholarly argument, the third one I list here, new institutionalist approach. I'm relatively friendlier with that, but still criticize, saying that who build institutions, who make effective and democratic institutions working, why ineffective institutions are now dominant in most Muslim majority countries? My own answer is that we have to look at human agency, particularly for social classes: economic, intellectual, religious, and political classes. And when the Muslim world was producing and being affected by dynamic intellectuals, dynamic merchants, it was superior to Western Europe, intellectually and economically. Then the stagnation started to have an impact in the 11th, especially mid-11th century. But it doesn't mean that Western Europe became supreme overnight. No, there was about 500 years of comparable levels of development. After the 17th century, scientific and economic domination of Western Europe began. Again, it was because of the class relations. Class relations in the Muslim world until the mid-11th century was based on scholars and merchants, whereas at the time, Catholic Church and royal authority dominate Western Europe. But after the mid-11th century, a reversal began with a path-dependent legacy. An alliance between Islamic scholars, ulama, and the military state emerged in the Muslim world, whereas in Western Europe, with the opening of universities, the rise of city-states, and institutionalization of church-state separation, there emerged a dynamic intellectual class and a dynamic bourgeoisie class. So that's the explanation how the reversal between the Muslim world and Western Europe occurred. So by scholars, I mean both ulama, Islamic scholars, and philosophers. In the so-called Muslim Golden Age, between 8th to mid-11th century, ulama mostly put a distance between themselves and the political authorities. I use many sources. One of them is very specific, Cohen's 1970 article, showing us that only 9% of ulama held official positions, 91% reject, and had private jobs, mostly being funded by commerce. One criticism I receive in many book reviews is that philosophers like Farabi, Ibn Sina, Biruni, who established the scientific aspect of Muslim Golden Age, receive patronage. That's what I emphasize in my book too. But the patronage philosophers received between 8th and 11th centuries, and then the patronage ulama received after the mid-11th century was very different, because philosophers did not establish an orthodoxy. Philosophers did not help the state to declare certain dissenting views apostasy. Philosophers did not have popular support, and they didn't have the ability to sacralize the government. But what happened after the mid-11th century was the opposite. The ulama somehow became and made part of the government and an ally of the state. It was a multi-level transformation of the mid-11th century and afterwards. Economically, iqta system replaced market economy. Politically, military states, mostly by Turks, Seljuks, then Mamluks, Ottomans, Safavis, replaced the old political system. A Sunni Orthodoxy emerged with the leadership of Abbasi caliphs Qadir and Qaim, taking certain Shias, philosophers, and Mu'tazili rationalist theologians as enemy, or at least the other. And this transformation began in Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, what I call ulama state alliance, institutionalized by Nizamiya madrasas, mostly funded and governed by political authorities. And the alliance between ulama and state became dominant in Syria, Palestine, Egypt in the 12th and 13th centuries. After the 14th centuries, it expanded from India to Balkans. Meanwhile, Muslims face the Crusaders and the Mongol invasions. But these invasions, in fact, further strengthened ulama state alliance, because when Muslims face tragedies, massacres, security threats, they turn their faces to the ulama and the military heroes such as Saladin. Saladin established Ayyubis, then Mamluks, and therefore in Mamluks, Egypt ruled by Mamluks, Ottoman Empire ruled by another military empire. They represent the best combination of military state and the ulama. Meanwhile, of course, there were philosophical, theoretical architects of the system like Ghazali in the 11th century and Ibn Taymiyyah in the 13th century. And that led the marginalization of intellectuals and merchants. As I said, Muslims continue to produce cutting-edge philosophers, thinkers like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Khaldun, but these were mostly neglected, and in the case of Ibn Rushd, even attacked, and some of his writings were perished and destroyed. So to conclude, after the Golden Age, mostly emphasized by a dynamic bourgeois and intellectual classes, Muslims end up with an ulama state alliance. After the Crusaders and the Mongol invasions, they recovered politically and militarily by establishing three empires, Ottoman, Safavi, and Mughal. But they never recover intellectually and economically because of the military state alliance with ulama ignored certain important developments in Europe, like the printing press. Using printing press and other tools, Europeans achieved Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, scientific revolution, and other processes of changes, whereas the Muslim world lacked the classes of intellectuals and the bourgeoisie. Muslims took the printing press 300 years after Europeans. And what is the result? The result is a very low level of literacy in the Muslim world. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, they estimate literacy rate just 1%, whereas it was 31% in Western Europe. So the Western colonization, as I said, came afterwards. Muslims already had problems, then they faced colonization. And certain Muslim rulers were aware of the problem. They tried to reform by sidelining ulama, by opening new schools and institutions. But these reform attempts mostly failed, not totally, but to a certain extent. A major reason was that these reform attempts came mostly top-down by state rulers, by political authorities, mostly with military backgrounds. And from Turkey to Egypt, the reform attempts really ignored the importance of the merchant class and intellectuals. And after the Iranian Revolution, Ulama State Alliance revived in many cases, especially funded by the oil money. So to conclude, Islam is not the culprit. Colonization is not the only cause either. Institutions matter, but we should ask who built them. And my argument is that today in the Muslim world, there are ineffective and authoritarian institutions built by the Ulema State Alliance, because the Ulema State Alliance have the ideology and power to build them. Thanks for listening. I'll be happy to have receive questions, have a discussion. Looking forward to that. Thank you.
Professor Malik, over to you for.
Thank you very much, Zubair, for inviting me to act as a discussant on Ahmed's book. I really enjoyed Ahmed's work, and I think one of the great contributions of this piece of scholarship is that it's very integrative. It's very synthesizes a large set of literature and highlights an explanation which I think has been ignored by prior accounts. So the idea that the alliance or the nature of relationship between the religious classes and the merchants is hugely important. Prior work by people, prominent scholars such as Timur Kuran and others, hadn't totally addressed that issue. I mean, there's talked a lot about the role that Islamic law could play in restricting prosperity, restricting expansion of prosperity. But what is the relationship between religion and these economic classes is a very important aspect. So in a sense, Professor Kuru, your argument really centers around how the nature of this relationship changed from 11th century onwards. And if I were to provide a very quick summary of it, it is basically to argue that for a long time, there was a very active relationship between these religious elites, between the ulama and the merchants. A lot of the merchants funded the ulama, and it obviously created independent creative scholarship, which challenged state authority. Now that relationship was switched. Rather than the ulama being more dependent on merchants, they became more dependent on the state, particularly the military classes. So I think that's a really interesting argument. I think you say that in a sense your argument is slightly different from the institutional explanation, but I think there are strong undercurrents of sort of an institutional approach in your analysis, particularly the idea that there are these different classes, right, which sort of interact. A lot of political economy is about the co-evolution of political and economic exchange. Your work has highlighted the co-evolution of this sort of exchange in a very distinct setting, which is where religion plays an important role. And religion is part of that larger political civil sphere, right? So sort of co-evolution of this exchange is very important. A lot of early political economy accounts also talked about the role of the church, right? So Francis Fukuyama's account, how the church was and its relationship with the state, its relationship with the ownership of land was also very crucial to those accounts. So your account is indeed very institutional in a way. The issue becomes particularly important because a lot of the institutional accounts emphasize path dependence, institutions or patterns or structures, relations that are formed way back in time tend to persist over time. And your work certainly creates that impression, right? So it tells us that the historic institution, which is the nature of relationship between ulama and the merchant classes, and the dynamics of evolution over time, in a sense, created a pattern of continuity, right? So that's part of your story. But if I could start off by asking a question that institutional economists are very interested in, especially a lot of those people who have looked at persistence of weak outcomes over time. And their question is largely been on, well, what are the mechanisms of continuity, right? How do, there's a relationship between ulama and merchants that changed over time, and therefore explains economic and political outcomes over time. What are the mechanisms through which this is taking place? Is ulama state alliance really part of the mechanism, or is there's another mechanism that you would bring forward? So, Ahmed,
are you asking now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So they are now cutting trees in my out space. And let me close down the window and come back.
Okay,
Okay.
and maybe I can continue and add another layer. So I think that's one key aspect of your analysis. The other big point, Ahmet, that I would like to highlight, maybe I could use this opportunity to raise 2 points. One is the more sort of mechanism of continuity. The other is that this switch that you explain, that there was a time way back when the merchants and ulama were integrated in ways that created ulama as a separate, supported them as a separate constituency. And then they became more dependent on the state, especially the military system. Now, one gets the feeling that this shift, what exactly is explaining that shift? Is it a truly exogenous shift, right? You know, is the elimination of these independent resources that the merchants provided? Is that an exogenous shift? Because there is work that suggests how the change in trade routes explain a lot of the patterns you are highlighting. So the discovery of the Cape of Good Hope, and then the discovery of Suez Canal. Even before then, Lisa Blades and others have argued that political fragmentation along the Silk Road created a shift in the trade routes. And this shift in the trade routes obviously was a massive shock to the power of the merchants. It undermined urbanization, prosperity. Now, is the shift that you're highlighting in any way linked with a larger shift in the trade routes? So maybe we'll start off with that and then build more questions and comments.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'm very sorry for the disturbance because they start to cut trees in my apartment complex. So I moved to a new room. Thank you very much, Adeel, for very effective summary and providing me with 2 thought-provoking questions and challenging one. Let me start the first one about mechanisms. You are right about asking whether ulama-state alliance is a cause or an effect itself, whether it is a mechanism or a set of mechanisms. I would say that it's a concept, ulama-state alliance, with multiple dimensions, which include certain mechanisms. And let me summarize in 3 points: ideological mechanisms, economic mechanisms, and political, of course. As we all know, there are 3 main sources of power, which means to force people to do things otherwise they would not do. You can either use legitimacy or economic patronage and money, or sheer coercion. When we look at the ulama-state alliance, why is it so successful for many centuries? Because it brought together all 3 mechanisms. And I try to elaborate them in my book, but further research and publications are of course necessary by other scholars. And I wish to see a team and many scholars working on these mechanisms. But what I tried so far to reveal is that ideologically, the ulama-state alliance began with the Qadri creed of Abbasi Caliph Qadir and his declaration of that certain Shias, certain philosophers and Mu'tazili scholars are infidels, punishable by death. And since that time until present, the ulama-state alliance have been very powerful and very smart to use ideological justifications, source of legitimacy as a major mechanism of their survival and the elimination of alternatives. For example, in the Quran, there is no verse referring to either state or the ulama as a class. There is only the term alim, and alim basically a knowledgeable person. But for centuries, scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah justify ulama-state alliance by referring to the famous
phrase in the Quran, ulul amri minkum, basically asking Muslims to obey God and then the Prophet. Then it says, ulul amr, those who have authority, minkum, among you. And then Ibn Taymiyyah and others says, ulul amr, those who have authority, are umara and ulama, the state class and the ulama class. And in terms of hadith corpus, they couldn't find anything, therefore they fabricated their hadith. Religion and state are twins. Religion is the foundation, state is the guardian, that without foundation collapses, that without guardian perishes. This is a Sasanian maxim said by founding king of Sasanian Ardashir 300 years before the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. But ulama state alliance use this to justify, and many refer it as an authentic hadith, which is not. So this is the ideological mechanism. How in mosques, today in Islamist political circles, and in Sufi tariqas, they use certain fabricated hadiths and interpretation of the Quran to ask Muslim obey and to justify their authority. There are many lines I've been able to find, for example, in Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin. Ghazali says that a merchant, after earning sufficient income in bazaar, had to leave early. And a good merchant, a pious one, should come late, leave early, doesn't focus on profit making. He also used a fabricated hadith about sea trading, saying that using sea voyage, boats and other ships is forbidden except 3 cases: Umrah, Hajj, pilgrimage, and jihad. So if you follow this discourse, then being merchant is despicable thing. At least it is inferior to be an alim or a state ruler. So that's the mechanism they kind of brainwash, propagandate to the young generations again and again, and perpetuate their authority for centuries. In Western Europe, Catholic Church was doing the same thing, but there was a division within the church by Luther. And if you look at Max Weber's Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, according to Weber, the revolution done by Luther was the idea that any job is a person's calling. During the Catholic centuries before Luther, being a priest was much more important than a lay person. But Luther said, no, any job is sacred, it's your calling. And then Protestants they start taking daily jobs, worldly affairs, as important as being clergy. But in the Muslim world, even today, when I go to mosque in Turkey, watch the TV sermons, etc., I see the emphasis on exclusively religious teaching, saying that if you become a hafiz, the person who memorized the entire Quran, you'll give shafa'ah, you'll be witness 70 of your relatives and bring them to heavens. So this emphasis being hafiz is much more than being a medical doctor, finding a vaccine, etc. This is the mechanism how they undermine intellectuals. When a hafiz, a religious scholar, die, they say, when the alim dies, the alam dies. The entire universe is crying. But when a physician, when a political scientist die, they never say that. Because you and I are not alim. We are just some philosophers with a bunch of ideas which are not important. That's the discourse in mosques. That's the discourse in Sufi tariqas. So this is the ideological dimension. There are also economic mechanisms. Let me very briefly note that. Since the Iqta system, for many centuries, ulama state alliance monopolized land revenue distribution. They turned the previous monetary economy into semi-feudal economy. The Iqta system was different from European feudalism. it was more humane, more open, because there was no serfs in the European feudal system. It was semi-slavery. Not the case in the Iqta system, much better, but still it was giving the chance to ulama and state monopolize the market, monopolize the economy, using land revenues for many centuries. In Egypt, for example, the Mamluks, the military class, had the money coming from the Iqta system, the land revenues. They were living in Cairo, using the rent, and the peasants and others didn't have the chance to establish their own independent economic entrepreneurship. Today, it's no longer the case, and land revenues are not important, but today there is another source of rent, oil. 60% of world oil reserves are in Muslim lands. In Saudi Arabia, in Iran, ulama state alliance, they are using oil money to fund their alliances. Neither state nor ulama are economically productive class, therefore they use the rent. Even in oil poor countries like Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan has been building an ulama state alliance for the last 10 years by using revenues coming from selling Istanbul's land. And today, Istanbul's lands are almost no longer providing enough revenues. Therefore, Erdogan is deciding to establish a canal, Canal Istanbul, parallel to Bosphorus, to get the canal fee like Suez Canal in Egypt, and to build residents in both sides of the canal, again, to produce rents. So this is the rentier economy as an important mechanism of reproducing, empowering ulama state alliance. Last but not least, so ideas and legitimacy, money, last but not least, coercion. Of course, that's the nature of the military state. From Egypt to Turkey to Pakistan to Indonesia, the main source of military power is physical violence. And they use it very effectively to perpetrate and reproduce the ulama state alliance. So that's my long answer, sorry for taking too much time, to your question about mechanisms. Now, briefly about your equally important question about the trade routes. Lisa Blaze and others focus on Indian Ocean and look how the Portuguese and others changed the trade routes, which may really create the gap between the Muslim world and Western Europe. I find it important, but incomplete. It would really be insufficient and simplistic to just focus on that. Why? First of all, what makes Europeans able to have geographical discoveries all around the world? When the Europeans arrive Americas and then find the Indian seaways in the late 15th, early 16th centuries, they expanded their economic wealth and political hegemony began. Ottomans didn't do that. And the first Ottoman ships arrived to Americas around 1860s, so 370 years after Europeans, by accident. Because the Ottoman Navy finally in 1860 said, so Basra is our port. And then today there is the debate whether to call it Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf. Ottomans call it Basra Gulf. And Basra, the city, is the Ottoman port. Ottoman said, let's send 2 Navy ships from Mediterranean to Atlantic, all the way surrounding Africa and reach Basra. And then in 1860, when they sent these 2 ships, because of the climate and then weather conditions, they were lost in the Atlantic and reached to Brazil. And finally, 2 Ottoman ships reached to Brazil. So my question is that I regard the Ottoman Empire as a geopolitical genius, geopolitically most important Muslim country, perhaps in history. But even them failed to take the printing press, 300 years after Europeans did, to arrive Americas 300 years after Europeans did. And you cannot say that, oh, Ottomans didn't care. Why didn't they care? Because they lacked the curiosity, because there was intellectual stagnation. And it wasn't simply seaway and ships. The book production, the first and only Ottoman book on Americas was written in 1570. So 70 years after Columbus, Ottomans had the last classical observatory established in Istanbul. Sokollu Mehmet Pasha was the Ottoman Grand Vizier, the last visionary person with a scientific understanding. He patronaged the establishment of an observatory by an Arab scholar, Taqiyuddin. And in that observatory, there were scholars. They produced a volume called Tarihi Hind el-Garbi, which means the history of West Indies, basically referring to Americas. And this book, 1570, was the last scientific production. The Grand Vizier died, Sokollu. Sheikh al-Islam, the chief ulama, said this observatory is really against religious teachings. It should be destroyed. The Sultan, who was really much focusing on astrology, didn't get any prophecy, then ordered the Navy to bomb, and they destroyed the observatory. From 1570 to 1800, Ottomans did not produce any book about Americas. So therefore, my basic answer is that Europeans, find that sea roads, but the Ottomans and other Muslims didn't catch up. They didn't pay any interest.
Right, great. Well, thank you very much for these very detailed answers. So we have about 20 minutes for this sort of exchange, and then maybe we could open for Q&A. So let us try and cover a few more grounds quickly, if possible. Couple of questions come up in your conversation. I mean, I was reading a very interesting piece on merchants in Damascus before the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And you find very interesting accounts of the way in which different merchant families were inserted into regional trade routes, particularly the Hejaz route. And things began to change, firstly with the discovery of the Cape of Good Hope, but then also in Egypt, you have the development of the new trade route buying through Suez Canal. And then you have the change of the Hejaz trade routes. There are a lot of these shocks that are coming. There are shocks to productive relations, to the power of the merchant class. And I think, in a sense, what you are doing is really opening up the big canvas for a lot of scholars to come around and pick these individual cases and study in more detail. And I really appreciate that. But one issue that comes up here is also, when you focused a lot on the relationship between the ulama and the state, right? And then between the ulama and the merchants. But whilst at the same time that the ulama state relationship is changing, the merchant state relationship is also changing, right? And so what is the importance of that relationship? How does this change? When you talk about rents, you were very right in saying that oftentimes you need to appease the religious classes by favoring them. But indeed, all governments, both contemporary and historical rulers, have given variety of privileges to merchants too, right? So if you look at Saudi Arabia today, yes, ulama are a big part of that distributive class, but they are the citizens, they are the merchants, and you give them privileges, concessions, monopoly concessions. What about the role of the state and the merchants, that sort of relationship? Another point, I mean, you don't have to respond to all of these points, but in a sense, I just want to bring them on the table, because this is what your book also does. It presents a fascinating account, a longue durée account that, all of us intellectuals can engage with. And on that one issue, I think I raised that in our previous conversation as well, and you must have come across the book by David Stasovich on democratization, on the emergence of democracy. And one of his explanations, or one of his central explanations, is about what is the technology for agricultural production, and also land-based empires, right? So when you have large land-based empires, they are more prone to developing centralized bureaucratic apparatuses that can undermine democratic development in the long run. That's certainly the case with the Ottoman Empire. That's certainly the case with a lot of the regions that are characterized as Islamic. So that's another issue that comes up. And if I may just sort of add another layer of complexity, which is this whole idea about, democratic deficit, your dependent variable that you're trying to explain, that Muslim world's institutional deficit, that itself is time varying, right? So if you look at some of the work by political scientist Faisal Ahmed at Princeton, he talks about, the emergence of democratic deficit amongst Muslim states and between Muslim and non-Muslim states. And he talks about how the discovery of oil, not the discovery of oil, but really the 1970s oil shock, really created a lot of those rents that you also talk about in your book. A lot of those rents were passed on to neighboring Muslim states in the form of aid and remittances. And you could see the emergence of a democratic deficit, which is time varying, which is not always explained by historical variables. Now, how would your explanation deal with not just the relative deficit of political institutions in the Muslim world, but a sort of continuing time varying persistence where, there's sort of this deficit changes over time and becomes more pronounced in certain periods. So sorry for laying out a lot of these questions together, but I just want to bring them on board for discussion.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'll keep thinking about these three questions, maybe days and weeks, but let me share very quick reflections. You're absolutely right about the state-merchant relationship. In my mind, the balance between the four is the key thing, because in Europe, state becoming much stronger with modernization. And in colonization, in capitalism, state definitely was an important player. So therefore, I'm not arguing historically or ideally for a bourgeoisie-based development or just intellectual-based development. I would not really like to live in a country ruled by philosophers. But in Europe, somehow, they managed to have each of the four with certain level of autonomy and strength. In the cases of Ottomans and others, merchants were undermined. For example, the Ottomans, focusing on the military geostrategy, give favorite positions to British and Dutch merchants. The idea was to contain Catholic Habsburg and then empowering Protestants to divide and rule Europe. So the Ottomans,
wasn't it the case that, in a sense, in the Ottoman world, rulers were able to rule without the consent of the economic elite, simply because they had a large land-based empire, whereas in Europe there was so much political fragmentation that they had to give some concessions to merchants.
Yeah, I would disagree, because this is too much deterministic in my taste. For me, there is always a room for agency. Things are not determined, especially if they are so much longue durée and large territory. We don't talk about simply Anatolia or Egypt, a small territory. We talk about huge Muslim world, 3 continents, from the Balkans to the Bengals. It cannot simply be explained by, for example, the water resources in the Nile or other rivers need to have a huge bureaucracy. It cannot simply be explained by agricultural change by the Mongol invasion, because throughout the Muslim world, in a large territory, there could have been multiple models. Yes, centralization in the Ottoman Empire, but why not decentralization in some part of North Africa? some part of subcontinent. Why do we see decentralization only in areas like Southeast Asia, Indonesia, where the ulama state alliance, the military state, very weak? I think that, yes, structural matters, conditions important, but agency with ideas, with philosophy important too. In the same geography, Muslims had commercial-based states for 500 years. They had strong merchant class for 500 years. But then a different ideology came with some Persian Sasani influence, with some new Sunni orthodoxy, then Shia orthodoxy, with too much emphasis on the military. And then the Ottoman Empire, for example, made a decision that we give concessions, favorite position to foreign merchants. They didn't care about infant industries. So, in fact, the necessity, social, political, economic structure, ask and otherwise, the Ottoman decision was wrong. It was against the structure because, look, Western Europe had mercantilism. Western Europe was supporting its commercial class. Ottoman ruling class did not have the luxury to say, oh, we don't care about merchants, because eventually they became a colony of Western merchants. They couldn't see the structural necessity. They were so blind and ignorant because of their obsession with geopolitics, obsession with military, and perhaps they were afraid of a strong Muslim merchant class. They didn't want to share power. But the result is the collapse of the empire. Before the military colonization, the Ottomans became an economic colony of Western Europe, which showed that their decisions were against the economic necessities. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there was a strong Muslim merchant class in Indian Ocean before the Portuguese came. But unfortunately, that class could not establish an alliance with intellectuals, did not have the political military power to defend them against the Portuguese. So therefore, the existence of the single merchant class in single area was insufficient, and they were destroyed by Portuguese, and then Dutch, then British, coming with commercial class supported by the military and politics. Then they brought their own intellectual class and pedagogy and educational institutions to subcontinent. You know better than me. So in the golden Muslim age, there was the combination of religious, political, economic, intellectual class. That's afterwards Europeans really emulate and represent. So that's one thing, the merchant-state relationship. And I think the second thing, can you remind me? Because
so it was about how there is time-varying democratic deficit. That
yes.
Muslim countries have become, the deficit between Muslim and non-Muslim world in terms of democracy has worsened, aggravated post-1970s oil shock.
Thank you. Let me combine I now remember your second point too about agricultural technology and then the oil. Again, they both are material structural explanations and very important. I briefly already explained how I disagree with the idea of agricultural technology, because Europe developed many technologies and Muslims didn't follow and catch up. That's what they need to deal with. And then when it comes to oil, I give credit to oil. As you said, rentierism is important. It's important to perpetuate and fund ulema state alliance. But one thing I briefly want to emphasize is that the impact of oil is relative. Norway, for example, has billions of dollars of oil revenue, and it's bigger than Brunei. But in Brunei, the same amount of oil money makes 90% of GDP, 60% of government revenue. Whereas in Norway, the same amount of money makes much smaller percentage of GDP and government revenue. The reason is that, of course, Norwegian economy is much bigger than the Brunei. So I would say that if Muslim countries had bigger economies by 1970, oil would not have had that much negative impacts. Therefore, the historical legacy of socioeconomic underdevelopment make oil easier to dominate the Muslim world. And in the future, if Muslims really want to minimize oil's authoritarian and negative effects, they should sophisticate and diversify their economies.
All right, thank you very much. Well, this is all very useful. I could keep on talking with you forever on this, but it's great that many of our participants from various parts of the world, many of them were students, it would fire their intellectual imagination. I would like to be the devil's advocate in this final segment a bit more, want to push you a little bit more to think about. And I think it's often very useful because when people ask me critical questions on the seminar, I'm thinking about them later. So if one were to think about your, one critique of your work could be to say, well, you start off by saying Islam is not the problem. But in effect, a lot of the emphasis on the ulama, the ideological component, the ulama-state alliance, very much supports the sort of conventional view within the West that, the ulama is the problem, Islam is the problem, who speaks for Islam, right? So in a sense, a lot of your, the thrust of your argument, which I have, great respect for, but I wonder that the thrust of this argument could be instrumentalized in the prevailing global war of narratives, where if you say colonialism is not the problem, if you talk about Islam being part of the problem, ulama, the Islamist movements are part of the problem. Do you provide a fodder to a lot of that conventional narrative, in a sense, unintendedly?
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond to that?
So many of my family members and friends raised that concern. And some of them asked me to just write in Turkish and translate it to Arabic, but not in English. They say, you are going to feel Islamophobia. I disagree. Why? First of all, these Islamophobes already have many writings, and I didn't feel or trigger anything. It already exists. And what I emphasize is that there are multiple Islams with S, and there are various ways of interpreting. Historically, it was different. Yes, today, certain versions of Islam, let's say Sayyid Qutb's milestones. In chapter 1, I analyze violence and show that it's multi-causal, and that's why I didn't put violence into the title of the book. I start analyzing violence, authoritarianism, and underdevelopment, but then I drop violence because every country contributes violence. American state defense budget is almost equal of the world state defense budget. And British Empire has had soldiers in 175 of 190 countries in the world. So in terms of violence, no one can compete with Western countries. But I still said that Sayyid Qutb's milestones or jihadi Salafism, or the idea that one verse in the Quran can abrogate 140 verses about peace in the Quran, they are related to violence. They are associated with terrorism. So in a sense that I'm trying to be a critical voice within the Muslim community, and my primary audience is Muslims, because some think tanks approached me for the last 2 years, asking me to write a policy paper for Western policymakers. I said no, because my main project in this book, in addition to scientific, if I have policy recommendations, I do them to Muslims. And for Muslims, when I talk to Muslim audiences in Indonesia, in Pakistan, in Turkey, Iran, and just 2 days ago, the Arabic translation was published. The idea for the Muslim youth, for my own children, to be really critical of the current situation by gaining inspiration from their history. Therefore, if there are some negative side effects, like a COVID vaccine side effects, of course, some Islamophobes can use, unfortunately, my work, but at least it's deeper than their simplistic preferences and citations.
Thank you very much. And also, you have, in a sense, raised the intellectual bar for the study of these questions. At least people can engage critically with the themes. I mean, in a way, you provide a view that obviously when you're dealing with a comparative scale and over many centuries, you have to simplify, right? And you have to offer an analytically coherent explanation. But it also reduces history, compresses history.
Yes.
It also compresses variation. And a lot of the students and scholars watching this episode today can appreciate that there is a lot of room for further work for looking at the evolution of ulama-state alliance in conjunction with other factors over time, right? And across different continents, because ultimately power is about the complexity of exchanges, right? There is one sort of exchange which is between religious and classes and economic classes, and the religious and the state, but the state and people, right? So there's a sort of multiplicity of exchanges, and they can shape many of your dependent variables. So it's obviously a very complex terrain. But thank you very much for offering us a very insightful account. Now, Zubair, I wonder if you could take over and maybe navigate Dr. Kuru's presentation and bring him in conversation with people who are asking questions or your own questions indeed.
Yes.
Let me tell you that your questions is one of the best sets I have received so far in the last 2 years. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very kind to hear.
Thank you very much, Professor Malik and Professor Kuru. We are just starting. So I would start with one of the questions that's been asked by audience, the very legitimacy of this question, that which try to explore relationship between Islam, authoritarianism, and underdevelopment, when similar questions are not asked about, say, Judaism or Christianity, or even Buddhism or, say, Hinduism. So how legitimate is your question?
Thanks. This is a very important question, but first let me check the voice. Is my voice clear in the new setting? Thank you.
Yes.
So first of all, when we look at Muslims, they want to identify themselves as Islamic. Today we have Conference of Islamic Cooperation, formerly called Conference of Islamic Conference, or no, Organization of Islamic Conference, now called Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And every of the Muslim majority country is a member of it. So this is not something I invented, but Muslim countries themselves identify themselves as Islamic. We don't have today that organization of Christian cooperation, etc. That's one thing, that Muslim countries really identify themselves with Islam, Islamic. Even if you ask people on the street, they are proud of being a member of Muslim world. The second thing is that, yes, of course, there are many analyses about Hinduism, Buddhism, Catholicism, how they contribute to authoritarianism or democracy. For many decades, Catholicism was associated with authoritarianism. In 1972, almost all Catholic countries were authoritarian, including Portugal, Spain, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, with many variations. Let me rephrase that. In 1960s and 70s, overwhelming majority of Catholic countries were authoritarian. And they were analyzed as such, but they changed. In 1979, 90% of Latin American Catholic countries were military dictatorship. When it reached to 1993, the number of military dictatorship was 0. So they changed. And that's why it was called the Catholic wave of democratization in early 1990s. And when the last point addressing your important question, I would say is that although my question specifically about the Muslim world, my answer is not. My book tries to develop a universal explanation that class relations matter in the Muslim world, in Western Europe, you can say in China too. It's universal. So I am not making an argument putting Muslims exceptional, unique, etc. No, I said wherever you have clergy-state alliance, you have problems in Western Europe, in today's Muslim world, even in my country now in the United States. What Donald Trump tried to build an alliance with politicians and evangelicals was very problematic. It was against intellectuals, and eventually it could have been really restrictive of ideas and economic entrepreneurship. So although the question is about Muslim world, the answer is very universal. And yes, we ask such questions about Catholics, Buddhists, etc.
Thank you very much. Another set of questions is being asked about very influential work by Wael bin Halak, The Impossible State. Interestingly, Wael bin Halak reaches exactly the opposite conclusion that you have reached. His argument is that Muslim countries have the crisis of legitimacy. And the crisis of legitimacy is that because the ulama, who were the custodians of change and fiqh, have been basically pushed back by the state, by the colonial state. So I would like you to comment on that.
So I read most of the writings of Wael Halak. He is a very important authority or expert on Islamic law Sharia. And I cited him and his important idea how Sharia emerged by private ulama rather than the state project. But when it comes to daily politics, I disagree with him. And I don't think Middle East politics or contemporary politics is his expertise or his strong area. And the book you refer to, Impossible State, in my mind, is too much focusing on modern state and made some really wrong assertions. For example, there was a line I was planning to cite, quote, and criticize, then I decided not to do, which says that the pre-modern era didn't witnesses the massacres modern state did. What about the Mongols? Was the Mongols modern state? No, they killed millions in Central Asian cities. So if you look at history, you see that classical state was as violent as the modern state. No need to put too much emphasis on modern state. And secondly, if Wael Halak went and lived few years in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey, he could have seen how the ulama were very effective to pushing blasphemy and apostasy laws, to shaping politics, to restricting liberties. So living in the United States and writing a book criticizing modern state while not criticizing Islamist ulama state alliance in the Middle East, I think a problem. And it's really needed to go and live for some years in those countries to see how ulama are really oppressive.
All
This
right.
is my answer.
Okay, great. This takes me towards writing of another influential scholar and your countrymate also, Timur Kuran, who basically, I mean, one would argue that, look, Professor Kuru, you are basically providing another variant of Timur Kuran's argument. For him, Sharia was the problem. For you, it's not the Sharia, it's the ulama. But the argument remains the same.
No, the argument is almost the opposite. So let me briefly summarize, because I spent a very long time to examine Timur Kuran's important writings. And I see my book and his book different on few important points. Yes, you are right that there are similarities. We both emphasize the problem and finding it some legal or jurisprudential authorities in the Muslim world. At this point, no, they are not opposite. I made a joke, but there are major differences. One difference is that my book really provides the reader with details of Muslim golden age. That's not the case in his book, it's different. And I try to explain the mechanisms of Muslims' achievement, success. As well as I remember, in his case, there was the idea that Muslim laws are stable input, stable cause. In early Islamic history, between 6 to 10 centuries, they work well because the alternative, European alternative, was inferior. Muslims remain stable causality, but Europeans became better. Therefore, what I understand in his book is that there is no decline. There is the European supremacy. Europe became better. I disagree. In my case, Muslims themselves decline because there is no stable causality. Muslims had dynamic class. Ulama were separate, put a distance between themselves and the political authorities between 8th to 11th century. Later on, ulama-state alliance emerged after they change everything, make the Muslim world declining, at least stagnant. And Europe was not stable either, but the change in Europe was not the laws. It was the institutions, it was the social classes, the emergence of dynamic bourgeoisie intellectual and separation of church and state. Therefore, it's a different story. And the basic summary of his that the Islamic law was fine at the beginning because there was no better alternative. Then things changed. In my case, no, Muslims were different. And in the future, if they go to their original class relations, they'll be better again. Yeah, so this is basically my answer is that law is something made by ulama and state. We have to look at who make the law rather than law itself.
This is really fascinating. Now I want to ask you a question more about methodology. How effective is your classification of these ulama class or merchant class? If I just give you example of Imam Abu Hanifa, who is a merchant during the morning and a scholar in the evening, and whose disciples are basically the chief justices like Imam Abu Yusuf. So to what extent your analytical categories are very effective in explaining a very complex phenomenon?
Yeah, in fact, very good question. Abu Hanifa himself, a very good case for me because he represents the combination of alim and merchant. That's the synthesis of the Muslim golden age that makes them independent and critical minds. But Abu Hanifa's two scholars, two main disciples, two of the three main disciples, Imam Yusuf and Imam Muhammad, accepted to be judges and qadis. But they were minority, they were exception. And Imam Yusuf, in fact, was criticized by many, including Imam Ghazali in Ihya Ulumuddin. And so I'm critical of some ideas of Ghazali, but I take him very seriously to understand certain issues. For example, Ghazali himself regrets that he had very strong relations with the state class. Therefore, after the age of 40, he stopped meeting the ruling class, receiving money, salary from them, teaching their institutions. Ghazali in his Ihya is very critical of Imam Abu Yusuf, for accusing him to be too much strategic and political, etc. Very negative things. I don't want to repeat. He said that in order not to give zakat, almsgiving, every year Imam Yusuf locates his money from one account to another, etc. in Ihya. Therefore, Imam Yusuf is not the prototype. The ideal prototype is really Abu Hanifa, what he represents, and he died for. The caliph asked him to be the judge. He refused, and he was imprisoned, then poisoned to death because of his strong stance. And it was, as I said, 90% of the Muslim ulama between 8th to mid-11th centuries, they were like Abu Hanifa. Scholars like Imam Yusuf and others were a minority and exception.
Professor Kuru, I think if the criteria for any book is that the more you engage with it, more inquisitive you become. So the more critical I just get of your work, the more convincing I just become, and the more I appreciate its explanatory authority. Now I want to ask you a question that to what extent these categorization that you do, it's a very complex phenomenon. Muslim world, like arguing about Muslim, from Algeria all the way to Indonesia and try to put them in one box. To what extent, I mean, this is a legitimate process of inquiry, because we just see that the same Muslims who were being pounced by Mongols in 1053 are really thriving in Andalusia, in Spain. And then the same ones who are being trounced in 1492 in Spain are really rising and are capturing and thriving in Constantinople, right? So to what extent, like the generalizations that we see in the work of many economic historians are legitimate empirical questions?
Thank you. In fact, as social scientists, we all analyze human beings. And I take Muslims just humans and Islam as a religion. There is nothing exceptional, unique, and they are very similar. And therefore, since I take a Muslim in Anatolia, Turkey, Ottoman Empire, very similar to a Christian in the United Kingdom, therefore a Muslim in Algeria resembled to a Muslim in Indonesia. Historically, the Muslim world had certain level of homogeneity with many differences. And a good example is Ibn Battuta. As you know, Ibn Battuta wrote possibly the longest memoir of journey, longer than Marco Polo, in his 14th, early 15th century memoirs of Ibn Battuta, Seyahatname, or his journey. And during these long voyages, Ibn Battuta traveled from Morocco to Arabian Peninsula, to Anatolian Byzantine Empire, to Crimea, Central Asia, India, Indonesia, and some reports says even China. We don't know, very authentic. And in this thousands miles long journey, many years, over 20 years, he got married multiple times and fathered many children, very strong manhood. But he was able to travel and earn money with three things: Arabic language, Sufism, and Maliki fiqh. And wherever he went, he was able to earn money and communicate. This shows early globalization of the Muslim world. And then since that time, we have certain level of similarities with some differences. Ghazali's ideas, for example, very influential everywhere. He is a Sunni, but the Shia version of Ihya Ulumuddin was written in Persian by an Iranian 12th Imam Shia scholar, and it's well read today, even today in Iran. His ideas were very effective in Andalus or Spain in the Murabitun dynasty. Al-Muhawid, Murabitun and Muwahidun, one of the dynasties, they directly inspired from Ghazali. And in the Ottoman Empire, Katip Çelebi, the 16th century Ottoman, the most important Ottoman author of perhaps the entire Ottoman history, Katip Çelebi says, Ihya Ulumuddin is the book read only second to the Quran in Anatolia and in the other parts of the Ottoman Empire. And same thing today, I would say that after the Quran and the Hadith, Ihya Ulumuddin of Imam Ghazali. So there are many sources of ideas, makes Muslims think similarly. And I look at them, one is Ghazali, the other is Mawardi. Wherever you hear the term caliphate, the only book, in fact, effectively written by the 11th century Shafi judge Mawardi. Even Ibn Khaldun in his Muqaddimah, when he developed a social scientific analysis of politics, he says, don't ask me about caliphate in legal terms. If you want to learn, go and read Mawardi. So there is very much, we have texts that makes Muslim word, different parts of Muslim word, very similar to each other. That's my answer.
Professor Kuru, that's amazing. I want to now ask you a question. So we have talked about history, and specifically your reading of history is for the sake of understanding particular phenomena with the purpose to kind of inform, if not formulate, a policy for the future. Now, I want to ask you, do you see this ulama-state alliance being challenged or getting weakened in future, or what we see happening in the Middle East and specifically in UAE and Egypt, Saudi Arabia, we see this alliance becoming much more nefarious, much more dangerous?
Thank you, an excellent question. So my short answer is yes. I expect, it's not just my wish, but my prediction is that ulama state alliance will be more challenging in the future, and it's already happening now. Why and how? One thing is the economic resources and economic basis. As I said, oil money has been in the last 50 years a major resource for ulama state alliance, but it will not be persistent in the future because of many reasons. One is depletion, the physical depletion of oil revenues. Second, the new technologies of energy will replace oil energy. We don't know when, but it will happen. Third, even if oil reserves are not depleted, no more new technology yet, oil consumption with the increasing population growth in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere domestically means shrinking of oil money coming from export. So therefore, there will be an economic transformation, and it is not easy. It is not very promising. There will be a crisis in many Muslim countries, depending on oil, with the decline of oil money. So therefore, what I am asking in terms of transformation of economic structure and religion-state relations is not just an intellectual desire, it is an economic obligation. And certain states are already aware of that. I just watched the video interview of MBS last month, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He's saying that Saudi Arabia is no longer able to impose strict Sharia laws. Otherwise, the tourists will not come to Saudi Arabia. So even in Saudi Arabia, with billions of oil money and very strict ideology of Wahhabism, the ruler is now saying that they need tourism money. They need to diversify economy. Therefore, they need a religious reform. Imagine other countries, Turkey and others, how they would be open to reform with economic necessity. That's one thing. The second thing is the new generation. Many public surveys document that there is a secularist generation coming in Turkey, in Iran, in Arab countries. I don't know about Pakistan. In Iran, according to a recent polls, 50% of population say they are no longer Muslim. So critics says this is manipulation, wrong data. If it is not 50, if it is just 40%, isn't it big? 30%. Still shocking. So the young generation will come to challenge Islamist ulama state alliance in Turkey, in Iran, in some Arab countries. I hope they will choose democracy rather than an assertive militant secularism. So that's my thoughts about the future.
Thank you very much. I think that's very interesting. Now, this is also quite challenging for your explanation because neither ulama nor Islam are monolithic. So what happened is that, take the example of Americans. So during Afghan so-called jihad in 80s, they chose a very Salafi, Deobandi kind of jihadist Islam. And now the same America has opted to choose for Sufi Islam. It's a hippie Islam, right? Same Islam. And I went to actually Islamic University, which were specifically created in order to produce jihadists. So much so that now the current spokesperson of Taliban in Qatar is actually my university mate. So he actually went to Islamic University. Now, the argument here is that there are so many shades of Islam that you can just pick and choose to appease to political expediency, basically.
Yes, that's what politicians do. And as you rightly said, the term mujahideen was a positive term for American policy against the Soviet Union. And Ronald Reagan dedicated one of the space shuttles to the freedom fighters in Afghanistan. But after 9/11, they wanted to use the term pejoratively. Instead of using mujahideen, this time negative, they said jihadist. So mujahideen, good guys, jihadists, bad guys. That's what politicians do. But as sincere Muslims or sincere intellectuals, analysts, social scientists, when we examine trends in terms of women's rights, in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of freedom of religion, there exists a problem in many Muslim countries. And unless we really put a deep analytical critical agenda on the table, things will be worse, not better. If you go to the doctor and the doctor say you have cancer, would you blame the doctor? You would be thankful for the diagnosis and start the treatment. I see the Muslim world, at least many Muslim majority countries like that. Of course, there are exceptions. Sufis in Senegal are pro-democratic, tolerant groups. In Tunisia, certain Islamists like Rashid Ghannouchi said pro-democratic messages. In Indonesia, two major groups, Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, one claimed to have 90 million, the other around 50 million members. They have pro-democratic ideas and they contributed to democratization. I just met with some leaders of Nahdlatul Ulama last week in DC, and one of them, Pak Yahya, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Nahdlatul Ulama, has declared a new reform movement called Humanitarian Islam. But Pak Yahya and other Nahdlatul Ulama members in Indonesia start this movement by criticizing the existing Islamic orthodoxy, how it legitimizes and gives ideas to ISIS and other radicals. And that's what, for example, they call humanitarian Islam, adding humanitarian as an adjective. Thank you.
It's wonderful, Professor Kuru. I think you have generated lots of interest, and your book has been translated into Chinese, Bosnian, and so many other languages. I'm sure that somebody who is listening to us will also venture to translate it into Urdu. Now, if you were to give a message to our Prime Minister who want to turn Pakistan into a welfare state, in his words, Riyasat-e-Madina, so what message would you give to Prime Minister Imran Khan?
So hopefully the Urdu translation will come. There is one publisher interested in. My knowledge about Pakistan is limited. I don't want to be too much assertive, but I think you refer to welfare state, right?
Yes.
On that point, I would say that balance is always a good thing, and Aristotle called golden means. In Islam, we call Sirat al-Mustaqim, between ifrat and tefrit, excess and deficiency. A totally capitalistic system where money rules is not humanitarian, and people with money like us should donate and then establish a system of support to poor and needy. That's for sure. But sometimes politicians, as we see in Turkey, use this idea of welfare state for their political purposes. They turn the people into the like children, always needing money from the state, always needing services from the state, seeing the state as a father. State is not the father, citizens are not children. And we should not make the people totally dependent on state, especially a government, especially a leader. Therefore, it's important to really have a dynamic competitive system, an open system, where private property is protected, where freedom of speech is protected, where individuals innovate, discover new things, contribute to the economy, where economic entrepreneurship is important. State's role is existing but limited. That's the balanced way I see, rather than a completely state control economy, state control of society. Yes, state may play a good role, but society and individuals should be independent and dynamic and creative themselves.
Professor Kuru, what an intellectual feast it has been interacting with you for 1.5 hours. I thank you very much for your time, for this fascinating talk, and hope that you will come and join us for other session. I wish you good luck for your next book project.
Thank you so much. You are very kind, and thanks for your generous words. And I'm very impressed by the Global Institute of Law, how you're really globally organizing activities, bringing together important people, and for UK, for Pakistan, for the world in general. You are making really a big contribution. I applaud and congratulate you.
Thank you very much, sir.